this NWCC webinar on a summary and synthesis of the latest knowledge on wind energy and wildlife. This is Paige Johnson with AWWI, and I'm here with Lauren Flynn and Ian Evans, also from AWWI, American Wind Wildlife Institute. So before we get started with the presentations, I'm just going to go over a few quick logistic notes. For sound, you should be able to hear us through your computer, but if you're having any technical trouble with the webinar, you're welcome to email me at pjohnson@awwi.org. You can also send me logistics questions through the questions box in the webinar room. And the way we're doing questions for this webinar is that we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. So if you have a question for the presenters, please enter it into the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar screen. You can type the question into the dialog box at the bottom and click the button at the right or hit enter to send it to us. You will only be able to see the questions you submitted in the box, not those submitted by others. Feel free to type in questions whenever they come up, anytime during the presentations, and then when the presentations are finished, we will read the questions out loud for the presenters to respond to. And finally, remember that we will be recording this webinar to post on the NWCC website along with the presentation slides. So the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to actually have a little adjustment to this schedule. We're beginning with Bats and Wind Energy Development with Chris Hine, Director of the Wind Energy Program at Bat Conservation International. Then we'll have a presentation on prairie grouse and sage grouse and response to wind energy development by Chad LeBeau, a research biologist with Western Ecosystems Technology Incorporated. The last research presentation will be Wind Energy and Raptors, presented by Tabor Allison, Director of Research for American Wind Wildlife Institute. And then at the end, Davia Palmieri, Energy and Adaptation Program Manager at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, is going to tell us about an upcoming wind wildlife workshop. So that's the agenda for today. So we'll go ahead and pull up the slides for Chris to present on bats. Okay, great. So whenever you're ready, Chris, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. Good day, everyone. I wanted to give you a brief update on bats and wind energy development and highlight some of the current research that is going on to help us better understand this issue. And so I thought I would start with this figure from AWIA's first quarter 2017 marketing report showing the cumulative growth of installed capacity. And I wanted to use this as a background and as a timeline with respect to some key studies over time that have helped us with our understanding or kind of initiated a suite of research over time. Although bat fatalities had been reported prior to 2003, it was at this point that bats really became a concern. A facility in West Virginia reported an estimate of up to 4,000 bat fatalities at the site in a year. And subsequent studies in the region were reporting similar findings, so it really started to raise the alarm bells for bats and wind energy. And as we began studying this in earnest, we began to understand that wind speed appeared to be a very important variable. And that bat fatalities were related to lower wind speeds. And in 2007, a study in Canada, which was the first for North America, looked at changing turbine operations to reduce bat fatalities, and they found a significant reduction in fatalities by making some changes to turbine operations in relation to wind speed. And again, subsequent studies provided relatively consistent results, and that feathering and raising cut-in speeds can reduce bat fatalities. However, since 2007, this study was published. Only 2 other additional studies have been published related to operational minimization strategies and the effect on bats. In 2008, the first study in the U.S. using thermal video cameras was conducted and published. Here, they were looking, the intent was to monitor bat interactions with turbines, and they noted some interesting behaviors, some interactions with bats and moving blades and what appeared to be attraction by bats, or at least certain species. In 2013, a second publication came out that corroborated a lot of these findings, and again confirmed that bats do appear to be attracted to these structures, or at least some species, though we still don't know what that attraction might be. In 2009, the first deterrent study was conducted at an operational wind energy facility. And here, the results showed that deterrent devices or broadcasting ultrasound could reduce bat fatalities, particularly for low-frequency calling species. And the publication from this study is still the only one available to date, but hopefully that will change here in the near future, because in 2015, the Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office funded 5 projects looking at 5 different technologies, and that really reinvigorated this pursuit into this type of impact reduction strategy. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. In 2013, several cumulative estimates were published. All used different assumptions, different data sets, and produced varying results. However, they all pointed to estimates of hundreds of thousands of fatalities, bat fatalities, occurring per year. So it really, this is 10 years from when we first became concerned about bats, and really provided some perspective for us about the magnitude of the impact. In 2015, another piece of the puzzle started to become apparent, and that was a publication that came out looking at the effective population size for eastern red bats. So we're starting to get an idea of the population of at least one species that is impacted by wind energy, and how that might relate to the impacts that we see and whether those are sustainable or not. Effective population size only relates to the breeding population, but it starts to give us some insight. A separate study also was the first to use miniaturized GPS transmitters to track hoary bats and give us the first clues about how they're moving on the landscape over the migratory period, and also how to secure transmitters for long-term deployment on bats, which had not been necessary before, because most radio transmitters are short-duration devices. So getting into a little more detail on some of these studies and where we are currently, the understanding the population of bats is an important factor. We want to know whether the existing fatality rate is sustainable. Unfortunately, it's not an easy task to get population or demographic data from bats, particularly for these migratory tree roosting bats. But we do know that bats have low reproductive rates and are long-lived, and that large-scale sustained mortality events can make it hard for their populations to recover. So in 2015, we have this one study on the effective population size of eastern red bats. In 2016, another study came out that supported the previous study's findings on eastern red bats, but they also looked at hoary bats. And there's a stark difference in the effective population size for these two species, with eastern red bats showing a much larger effective population size. And this suggests that, at least for red bats, they might be potentially better able to absorb these large-scale sustained mortality compared to hoary bats. A paper published earlier this year based on expert elicitation also kind of pointed to a relatively low population size for hoary bats, and that given a number of assumptions, wind energy impacts on hoary bats could cause the population to decline by 90% in the next 50 years. Now, again, there were a number of assumptions associated with this study. The authors assumed a starting population of 2.5 million, a lambda growth rate of 1.01. They used the lowest cumulative fatality estimates from those 2013 publications, and they held wind energy constant at the 2014 levels. So it gives us kind of a baseline to start from and to look at maybe some other factors to expand on this publication and publications in general looking at population level data for bats. Moving on to some strategies to help reduce the impact of wind energy on bats. Talking about deterring bats from wind turbines, as I mentioned, the DOE has stepped up in recent years and provided near, I think it's $1.75 million to 5 projects to investigate deterring bats from wind turbines. 2 of these projects are looking at deterrents that are mounted on the nacelle. 2 are looking at devices that are mounted on the blades, and 1 is looking at a textured coating that is applied to the towers to prevent bats from perceiving the tower as a potential resource. There's good summaries of these projects on the website listed here, so I'm not going to go through them. And they're all in various stages of being completed, but I think this summer is the last summer for these projects, and so final results should be coming out over the next several months into 2018. I do want to highlight that BCI is working on a number of deterrent projects with NRG Systems, the manufacturer of one of these devices, and working with a number of wind energy partners, different types of turbines, and so really getting some experience at how to integrate these systems on different platforms. These projects also have different species and different environmental conditions, which is good to get a suite of parameters on how effective they are in different environmental conditions and different species. And then one of these studies, the one that is involved with the DOE, is comparing the deterrent devices to feathering up to 5.0 meters per second cut-in speed, which we have a lot of data on, and consistently shows on average of about a 50% reduction. So that's our initial goal, to see how successful these devices can be. With respect to operational minimization, early on, and for a number of years, the idea was to test different cut-in speeds and see how that reduced the fatality of bats, and so they were primarily focused on just wind speed. But more recently, we've looked at, a number of studies have looked at incorporating other variables. And one that was published earlier this year incorporated temperature along with wind speed, such that the turbines were shut down at with wind speed as a variable. And they showed a significant reduction in fatality. And so this could be a strategy that helps reduce the amount of time that turbines aren't generating electricity and be more amenable for implementation. At the Wind Wildlife Research meeting back in December, there was a whole session on different strategies to refine operational minimization, and summaries of those presentations are available to review, so I won't go into too much detail, but really interesting approaches incorporating a number of weather variables, how the turbine makes the decision to turn on and off to reduce the number of start and stop times, and then also incorporating acoustic data into the models or into real-time triggers to inform the turbines when to shut down. With respect to post-construction fatality monitoring, there's a lot of advancements going on here as well. I gave a presentation at the Wind Wildlife Research meeting on a new estimator that is coming out that the group that's working on this has spent a number of years on. This is a collaboration with a number of statisticians from WEST USGS, Duke University, and partners over in Portugal and Switzerland, along with industry members, Avangrid and Sun Edison, BCI and AWWI, looking to develop this generalized estimator. And we finally got moving on it. We're going to introduce and test a draft version of this at a workshop at a conference in Europe in early September, get some feedback and revise as needed, and hopefully have something available for use next year. Also, with respect to monitoring, there's some efforts looking at the fall distribution of bats, and there's some indication that bats fall farther from the turbine at higher wind speeds. And this has implications for studies that use relatively small plots. And if you're trying to relate fatalities to wind speed and you're not searching out far enough, you could bias your results. Or if you're doing an operational minimization study and you only have relatively small plots, you might be missing some of the data that's necessary to get a precise and accurate assessment of the effect of that minimization strategy. And lastly here, a number of efforts looking at estimating fatality from road and pad searches. And this, if this proves out, this would be a great cost-effective approach to monitoring. Companies no longer need to pay landowners to not plant crops or mowing costs that are associated with, large circular or square plots. So it would be really good if we can come up with something that's more cost-effective there. A number of folks are working on the behavioral aspect of bats at wind turbines using thermal or night vision cameras. These can be expensive, and they're certainly not warranted at every location, but they can provide very important information, particularly with respect to the specific timing and conditions of interactions. And if you can compare these cameras with acoustic detectors, we might be able to get species-specific interactions and answer the question of whether bats are echolocating in and around turbines. And it's likely that that varies by species, and there's some evidence for that. But not only is there the component of going out and recording the data, but how we process it and analyze it, there's a lot of work being done to efficiently and effectively ID targets from the video data using processing software, so you don't have to watch a whole bunch of video. And then advances in 3D processing, where you can look at the traces of bats in the airspace relative to the wind turbine and really get a better understanding of how they're interacting with these structures. And the implications are really important with respect to impact reduction strategies. These types of data can help us determine where to place and orient deterrent devices, whether bats are echolocating, and if they're not, then acoustic-triggered strategies may not be effective for some species. And then, given that we can get specific timing and conditions, just refining operational minimization strategies. And there's enough work going on now that I think it's warranted to bring in some of these people, experts that have been working with the technology and the analysis together to consolidate the methodologies, the approaches, and the findings, and so we can get more out of the research. AWWI has an initiative using species distribution models to understand variation in fatality rates of hoary bats, and this is a very good approach to which might help with sighting decisions. We know that bats travel long distances each night and during the migratory season, and their decisions may be based on regional features rather than site-specific characteristics. So getting a broader sense of what's going on in the environment, resources that might be available to bats may reflect on which sites are maybe greater or have a higher risk than others. Also helping us understand bat migration patterns, there's a couple other technologies that we can use. We can use acoustic activity, and there's the Bat Acoustic Monitoring Portal, which you can upload long-term data sets, really any data sets, but long-term data sets are especially useful because it allows us to track bat activity over space and time. And this is a program that's run by the Forest Service that, with the data that we already have, has shown some pretty amazing movement patterns based on these acoustic monitoring stations. And then there's also a number of different ways that we can track bats. And they all have their positives and negatives, but they provide useful information. Piper Roby gave a presentation at the Wind Wildlife Research meeting of her efforts to use both aerial and ground tracking techniques to monitor Indiana bats during migration. GPS tags and data loggers are now getting small enough that we can use them and get information not only on their movements, but what bats are doing during their movements. And one paper showed that hoary bats spend a lot of time in torpor over the winter, and so they're not always active. And then MODIS technology is being used by some groups, which is great because you don't have to have the person power to try and track these individuals. You can place these small tags on bats and use these automated stations that operate every single day of the year to record, to pick up those signals from those tags. Brief update, approximately every 3 years the BWEC gets together with all the advisors. There's 21 members from a number of different stakeholders. And we talk about priorities, we assess what information we've been able to gather. And it would have fallen on January 2018, but we decided to postpone that to June 2018 based on the availability of all this deterrent research that's being done, and it's such an important factor that we felt that we needed to have that information before we could discuss priorities. So we plan on having that meeting in mid-2018. And I want to acknowledge this new initiative that NREL started that's funded by the DOE that brings together a lot of the partners that are involved in this type of research, AFWA, AWWI, and the BWEC, to better organize and communicate what each group is doing. And it has provided a funding mechanism for a lot of the research that is going on. And then lastly, you know, we've made a lot of progress. We still have some work to do. Getting comparability among studies will always be important. Transparency is important. Having data to use for meta-analyses. We need additional methodologies to develop more robust cumulative estimates and get an understanding of the population of bats to know what those fatality rates mean with respect to the population. We also just need basic biology on bat movement patterns. We need some more information on how to assess risk to inform siting, and continue to work on cost-effective impact reduction strategies. And then lastly, offshore wind is developing rapidly, yet we don't have the methodologies or the techniques to study the impacts of offshore wind energy development, and we need to get moving on that before it gets too far ahead of us. With that, that's it for me, and I'll be happy to take questions later in the webinar. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris, so much for your presentation. And this is just a reminder that you can type in any questions that you have into the Q&A box at any time, and we will read those out loud when the presentations are complete. So next up, we have Chad, who's going to be presenting on prairie grouse and sage grouse. All right, here we go. Chad, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great. Thanks for having me here, and great presentation, Chris. It was really informative. So I'd like to present today of what I currently understand the most up-to-date research and a review of that research. So wind energy development is a new form of anthropogenic disturbance to sage grouse and prairie grouse. There's indirect impacts and there's direct impacts associated with that. However, there's very few studies that have reviewed these potential impacts, and I'm going to talk about the four that are known and have peer-reviewed research on. But again, there's very few information out there, but I think we are starting to see some important trends, and it has been interesting following this as new research is coming coming aboard, it is interesting to see these trends, and I'm going to try and talk about a few of these trends. So with wind energy development, similar to other forms of anthropogenic development, there's concerns over direct habitat loss. That's the removal of grouse habitat. There is the indirect impact of displacement, where grouse would select habitats and a facility come in, and they are forced to shift away their habitat selection patterns away from that habitat that they would have originally selected. And that shift could result in reduced fitness, reduced population viability. And so it's important to understand these potential concerns and gear our research toward these concerns to help answer some of these questions. There is also the concern of reduced connectivity. Grouse are a landscape level species. They require different habitat types during different time periods. And it is important that we understand how grouse move in between these habitats if there's anthropogenic features such as turbines or access roads. These are important information to figure out whether they're avoiding going around them or not avoiding them. So the connectivity is of concern, and we want to make sure that all habitat is connected and that they can move freely around. So here's the four the study sites that I'm aware of that have some published research on. A lot of these I've been involved with NWCC over the years. The Meridian Way in north central Kansas. This is a study where there was pre-construction data collected and then post-construction data, and numerous publications have come out from that research, and I'm going to talk about some of those results. More recently, the Answorth facility in Sandfield, Nebraska. This facility has been around for quite some time, but we are now just starting to see some research emerge and some results emerge from this facility. There is a project that is in Idaho, near Idaho Falls, and they're studying Columbian sharp-tail grouse. Essentially 4 wind projects, but they're all right next to each other, so it's considered maybe just one project. But that is a new thesis that came out of Idaho. And then the 7 Mile Hill sage grouse research, and I've presented the studies on our most recent study, the last 6 years of study in NWCC last December. So the presentation is on the website, and I can certainly provide it to anyone that is interested. But that essentially detailed what we saw and what we found for the last 6 years of that collaborative effort to the NWCC. So if we go back to our potential concerns, the first one was direct habitat loss. Removal of habitat can affect grouse species. I have a few pictures here where, the access roads, the turbine pads, albeit small disturbances, it is an actual direct disturbance, so we are removing that habitat, and a grouse can no longer use that habitat. So that is a one potential concern. And there's displacement. Our grouse moving away from the facilities and selecting lower quality habitats and therefore reducing in lower fitness and overall population viability. There are a few different aspects of the grouse biology. Nesting, brood rearing, wintering is important, and summering is important. So these are main life cycles of the grouse, which have been investigated and should be investigated going forward because they all relate to the overall population viability. So if we just look at nest site selection, and this is a review of those 4 studies that I mentioned. So this is based on our best available knowledge, albeit small, but it is, from what I understand, the most up-to-date information. The Kansas study, the Meridian Way, found no effect on greater prairie chicken nest site selection. The turbines weren't influencing that. Harrison thesis in the Ainsworth facility in Nebraska also saw no effect as a wind facility on nest site selection. Prowett, Matthew, and Columbia sharp-tailed grouse, again, saw no effect, and then we saw no effect in greater sage grouse in our study. So it appears that that grouse are selecting habitat irrespective of turbine location, and most of these studies pointed out that habitat, what was on the ground, was influencing selection more than the presence of turbines, and so it really is important to have that habitat around for nest site selection. So general habitat selection, we did see, our Harrison did not find any effect of the brood-rearing habitat selection in their Nebraska facility. Winder et al. In the Kansas Meridian Way did find a negative change in space use during the breeding season. They looked at kernel home ranges, and these kernel home ranges had information prior to development and then information post-development. And they did see a shift in home range use relative to turbines during the post-development period. And in greater sage grouse, in our study here in Wyoming, we did see that sage grouse avoided habitats with higher density of turbines during the brood reign and summer period. So it is important to note that this is, I'm talking about density here, not distance too. We investigated distance to turbine, but it was more so important the density of turbines. So it appeared that individuals selected habitats in and around the facility, but when you moved into denser areas where we have maybe more dense turbine strings, we did see an avoidance there during the brood reign and summer period. And so here are some pictures depicting that shift in use. The image on the left is from Blinder, the Meridian Way facility, the pre-development home ranges, and then on the bottom figure there's the post-development home range. So you can see a shift and change there. And the figure on the right is from our most recent publication in Journal of Wildlife Management. And the top layer is nest site selection. You can see the red is the higher predicted probability of use. We have in and around turbines. And then as you move to the brood reign in summer, you start seeing a shift away, albeit not much, but you can still, we still detected that shift. So another displacement is male lek attendance, and lek count data is difficult to analyze. There's a lot of variability in lek count information, so it is a good tool to have because we have a lot of pre-development data or trend information associated with lek counts, but there are a lot of assumptions that are involved with lek counts. They vary from year to year. They're based on whether a field was burned or not. So there is shifting, and it's largely based on habitat or drought or the productivity from the year before. So in the few studies that looked at lek count analysis, the Meridian Way and then ours at 7 Mile Hill, the Meridian Way facility saw higher lek abandonment within 8 kilometers of turbines, and so they looked at the leks beyond 8 kilometers and leks close within 8 kilometers, and they saw a change in our higher abandonment with leks and closer to 8 kilometers. However, they did not detect a significant effect of proximity turbines to lek persistence or male lek attendance. So there are some mixed results there suggesting some variability in what is actually driving lek persistence out there or lek abandonment. In our greater sage grouse study, we did have some pre-development data, and we compared that to the post-development data, and it was compared between the control and treatment area, and we saw no significant differences in male attending leks between the control and treatment area, between the pre and post-development period. And this was similar to trends across the state, where they're in decline prior to development, and they stayed in decline post-development, but there wasn't any changes between the control and treatment area. So that was an interesting result there. So if we go to fitness and survival, so if we talked about displacement, are sage grouse or are grouse avoiding turbines and therefore resulting in lower productivity, population level effects. In the Greater Prairie Chicken studies, the two that looked at that, there's no effect on nest survival. The Columbian sharp-tailed grouse found no effect, and then we also found no effect. And so again, nest site selection, they are selecting the best habitat, and that best habitat is also influencing nest survival. Brood survival in the Nebraska facility, no effect, and Columbia sharp-tailed grouse Prairie study did find a negative effect in habitats with higher density of turbines, and we found no effect in our greater sage grouse study. Female survival, which appears to be one of the most influencing fitness parameters in population dynamics and population viability. Greater Prairie chickens, they found no effect in the Ainsworth facility, no negative effect in the Meridian Way facility, and we saw no negative effect. And when I say no negative effect, I mean that the thought was investigating whether turbines were influencing survival or not. In both the Winder and our study, the Kansas and Wyoming study, saw a positive effect of the facility. So grouse that were using habitats with higher density of turbines in the sage grouse had higher probability of survival. In the Greater Prairie Chicken study, they saw that survival increased from pre-development to post-development closer to turbines. And so that was kind of an interesting trend too, that there's a number of things that could be influencing that, and all speculations at this point, but maybe the avian predators are the major predation source of adults and adult grouse, and maybe the avian predators are avoiding the facility. We did a concurrent avian predator study that detected a lower density of avian predators near the facility compared to away. That's unpublished data, but it is some ancillary information and important to note. But it was interesting to see the same trend in two studies, and then the no effect trend in Nebraska. So, we talked a few about, what is known. There obviously is a lot more information that we can collect and is necessary to get at some of these cumulative effects. We need some multiple studies. We only have one greater sage grouse, one sharp-tailed grouse, and then we have two greater prairie chickens. And I imagine that a lot of these impacts are going to differ throughout the range, such as they do with other anthropogenic features. There's habitat varies across all of these grouses ranges, and the effects could be different at different populations. You also have migratory populations versus non-migratory populations. So a lot more studies are going to be necessary to help inform some of these risks. Also, connectivity between key habitats. I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. That is one of the potential concerns, and we don't have any research addressing that connectivity component yet. We are looking to kick off 7 Mile Hill research again this spring, and looking for support on that. But the figure on the right there shows connectivity patterns of female sage grouse, and this is by VHF information, so it's kind of connected off. And we're hoping to get some more information on grouse movements using GPS data loggers. So that will provide a more detailed picture on how they're moving between leks, moving in and out of turbines. So that would be interesting to see how they connect between key habitats. Also excited to note that this spring we kicked off our first lesser prairie chicken telemetry research study in Kansas, the Cimarron Bend Wind Project. There we captured and monitored 25 chickens in and around turbines, and we're collecting some of that movement data, and that all that potential questions that I addressed earlier hopefully will start being addressed for lesser prairie chicken, because we don't have any information on lesser prairie chickens. at this point. So with that, in summary, again, this is based on the best available science to my knowledge, and it does provide. It is starting to provide a picture that maybe wind energy development is not as potentially harmful as we thought. Tall structures on a landscape where grouse evolved with no tall structures was a major concern. But we are seeing some peer-reviewed literature coming out where maybe the effects aren't as bad as we thought. And so we have different parameters that all affect population viability and that have been studied, and we can start seeing these trends. Net survival, no effect. Brood survival, we did see a negative effect in sharp-tailed grouse. That was a 2-year, I think it was a 2-year study, so maybe more data collected there will help better inform that. Annual female survival, we're not seeing any negative effect, which is one of the most important parameters in sage grouse populations. Nest site selection, we're not seeing any effect. Brood selection and breeding selection. So we are seeing some displacement effects happening during the brood reign, the summer period. We are seeing a shift away, but that is expected. But this shift isn't resulting in major declines in population fitness or a reduction in population viability. So that's important to note. That we are seeing a shift. Is this shift great enough for population level consequences? We're not seeing that at this time. And then changes in males attending leks, and that's the a lek that has constantly been 10, 15 birds. How is that lek changing relative to turbines? And those leks that have these larger number of birds, those are the most consistent ones that you can start attributing outside influences to that to those effects. And so we're getting some more information, and I hope to stay on track on this. And so if there's any other research out there that I'm not aware of, I would please send my way so that I can be better informed. But this is where we're at right now, and it's interesting to see starting to see some of these trends emerge. So with that, I'll be looking forward to some questions at the end. And I think we are providing these PowerPoints, and so I thought it'd be useful to have all the citations that I used in the PowerPoint on one place. So
Great. All
right. That's all I have.
Thanks so much, Chaz. That was great. And next up, we are going to have our final research presentation, which is presented by Tabor Allison, and he will be talking about migratory birds and raptors. So Tabor, go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Paige. Actually, I'm going to be focusing primarily on raptors and less on migratory birds, although I will reference. Specifically, just talk very briefly about the summary and context of impacts. And the impacts I'm focusing on are exclusively collision fatalities. Chad did a really nice summary of habitat impacts on prairie grouse. And I won't be touching on those impacts or impacts on other bird species, habitat impacts on other species. So then I'll also talk about reducing impacts, how activities intended to reduce collision impacts to raptors, and summarize, as Chris did, with some research needs. So it's well known that if we put something up in the airspace, birds are almost certain to collide with them, whether they be buildings, towers, transmission lines, or wind turbines. At wind turbines, just to summarize, various cumulative assessments that have been conducted recently in the past few years. We've come up with approximately 250 different species of birds found as collision fatalities. But trying to evaluate or understand what leads to higher or lower collision risk has been very difficult and is likely species dependent, with some interaction between the behavior of the species and its abundance. But notably, at least to date, a lot of information has been collected over the years to try and assess bird activity as a component of risk, collision risk. And those attempts have largely been unsuccessful, with the potential exception of raptors, where a variety of reports, particularly pre-construction reports prepared by the industry, suggest that collision mortality is related to activity and abundance of raptors. And a good summary of that can be found in the comprehensive guide written by Dale Strickland and several other authors. Whenever we talk about impacts of fatalities, we always need to keep in mind what I would summarize as a couple of issues with regard to fatality estimation, and this has been a frequent topic of conversation in the literature. Most recently, for example, a paper by Manuela Husso and others published in Human-Wildlife Interaction back in 2016. But I would summarize these issues as one of representation and detection. Representation, I would largely reference, most of what we know, or practically all of what we know about collision fatalities at wind turbines to date come from publicly available reports. And not all reports become publicly available. Some regions and states of the country require reports to be, fatality monitoring studies to become publicly available. Others don't, or often didn't require them. So the cumulative assessments represent a non-random sample of the studies that are out there, with over-representation in some regions and underrepresentation in others. So what we know has to be underlined by the non-random nature of the data that we have available. Detection under that actually covers a multitude of different issues, but largely it could be because of differences in protocol from one study to another, and the different difficulties in being able to compare estimates. Protocols are becoming more and more standardized, but still, even with the correction factors and various trials to evaluate detection bias, there's still an issue with understanding how variation in detection among studies influences what we know. And then there also is variation in detection among species, which has been evaluated less on a species-specific level. But we certainly know, for example, that large birds and raptors have a higher detectability than smaller birds, songbirds, for example. But be that as it may, I'm still going to, make a comparison here, recognizing the caveat, because largely I wanted to talk about if there is, when we talk about tall structures and the hazards they present to birds, if there is a differential hazard that wind turbines might present to birds at collision risk, I would say that raptors would be a group that would be an example of potentially having a higher collision risk with wind turbines than other anthropogenic structures, with the possible exception of transmission lines. The data that I'm just showing you here are summarized, percentage of fatalities based on cumulative assessments in the case of Erickson et al. Published in PLOS ONE, where about 60% of the fatalities recorded were passerines, small passerines, and about 8 to 9% were raptors. And just by comparison with communication towers, and these data here I chose because Joel Gehring and others used search methods that were essentially identical to those used at wind turbine facilities. Other communication tower studies and not to follow strict protocols. So they're probably as comparable as the data can get, with the exception that the communication tower data was only collected during the spring and fall migration, and has probably introduced some bias. It's not accounted for here. But the point here is not to compare wind turbines and communication towers specifically, but just to illustrate, when you're looking at collision fatalities at wind turbines, raptors are an important group, which is why I'm focusing on them now. We do have recently a paper given at the NWCC meeting, which is being prepared for publication, given by Shay Howland and others, have come up with national estimates for raptor fatalities, essentially a companion paper to the paper that Wes published in 2014 on small songbird fatalities. Both of these studies were funded by AWWI, and you can read the paper summary at the proceedings of the Wind Wildlife Research meeting, and hoping that a paper will be coming out on that soon. There are regional differences with higher numbers of raptor fatalities in the western U.S. And when looking at the percentage of fatalities, or the number of fatalities as a percentage of estimated population, based on typically on partners in flight data, the numbers are still low, approximately 0.5% or less, but representing a higher percentage than songbirds, what was estimated for songbirds. And so, given the caveats we have about these estimates, the numbers still appear to be relatively low relative to population size, but there are concerns about what we often assume is additive mortality of raptors, which are a long-lived, typically long-lived and low fecundity group. And so, for example, just thinking about golden eagles in the recent revision of the Eagle Rule, the service notes in their status report that adult mortality from anthropogenic sources, all anthropogenic sources, including mortality in wind turbines, may be limiting population numbers of golden eagles. And so the service concluded for that group, that species, that no additional mortality can be sustained for a stable population. And so we don't have as much detailed information as we do for other raptor species as we do for golden eagles, but there are concerns for many of those species as well. I am getting blank slides here.
Tabor, we can see them. I'm wondering if it's your internet connection that may be causing that. So I can advance the slides for you. Do you have a local copy you could look at?
I do. I have it open. Interesting.
If anyone else is not seeing the slides on your webinar screen, let us know in the Q&A pod.
This is Davia. I can see them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Huh.
Sorry, folks. Just give us 1 minute while we...
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on because as far as I can tell, I do have an internet connection.
Okay, well, we can advance them in the webinar if you have a local copy you want to reference.
Okay, so this will be a little awkward, but I'm looking at slide estimating impacts to Raptors.
Yep, we have got that one up now.
All right, excellent. So most recently at the NWCC research meeting, there were several interesting presentations about estimating impacts to collision fatalities that apply to estimating impacts to Raptors. And Chris referenced the development of in his presentation, he referenced the development of the generalized fatality estimator. And then Wes, working with Avangrid and USGS, have been evaluating several different kinds of approaches to collecting fatality data and developing Raptor-appropriate correction factors. And by Raptor-appropriate, I mean using appropriate surrogates to evaluate carcass persistence. Oftentimes, ducks, for example, waterfowl are used to estimate carcass persistence for raptors. That's questionable whether that's appropriate. We're also working to increase the amount of available data for analysis. Many of you may be familiar with the post-construction fatality data that AWWI had, the American Wind Wildlife Information Center, and we're reached an critical mass, I would say, in the amount of data that we have in the database, and we're moving forward with conducting the first analyses that we hope to have or intend to have available at the end of the year, and hope to be able to share more information with you on that in the near future. Okay, next slide. Reducing impacts to raptors, focused on the 3 steps in the mitigation hierarchy: avoidance of impacts, minimization of impacts that can't be avoided, and then compensation or offsetting of any impacts that can't be avoided or minimized. If we look at avoiding impacts to raptors, I mentioned at the beginning that there has been data that suggests that raptor activity and abundance are correlated with collision risk, and so avoiding areas that funnel or concentrate raptor activity and abundance and identifying what those features are would be an important avoidance strategy in siting wind facilities. And there's also been a fair amount of work using the same kind of technology that Chris was talking about for tracking, getting frequent locations and height for raptors, such as the work that Todd Kastner and Tricia Miller have done on golden eagles, both on the Appalachian ridgelines and out west, and also working on bald eagles and California condor research conducted by USGS. All of this information can be useful in both macro siting, as in locating of facilities, and the micro siting of individual turbines to avoid areas where raptors are concentrated or are flying and behaving in such a way that might increase risk. Minimization strategies, there's certainly been a lot of thought put into this. One of the earliest tests was focused on increasing blade visibility. There hasn't been, to my awareness, a whole lot of work done on this. There was one test conducted at Foot Creek Rim by Dave Young and others. I think that date is wrong. It should be 2003. And they found no effect, no reduction in collision risk by painting blades with UV. The Altamont, which is infamous for its high raptor mortality with older generation turbines, and there's been a lot of repowering and replacing these older generation turbines with taller, more widely spaced turbines, higher capacity, and it appears that it's resulting in substantial reduction in raptor mortality. One of the initial assessments published by Smallwood and Karras in 2009, and Sean Smallwood, who's done extensive work, has also evaluated and identified removal of problem turbines that present particularly high collision risk. Another minimization strategy, this is widely applied, as Chris mentioned, for bats, is curtailment. And I would define two kinds of curtailment: informed versus blanket curtailment. With blanket curtailment being all turbine shutdowns, such as seasonal shutdowns of the Altamont Pass, with the goal of reducing focal species mortality, raptors like golden eagles and red-tailed hawks, by 50%. And recent reports by ICF International, there's a report and a paper at the NWCC meeting that suggests that this kind of seasonal shutdown was effective for golden eagles in particular in reducing mortality. Blanket curtailment has been applied for night migrants, and in conjunction with radar at the Gulf. And I'm aware, I know these studies have been conducted, but I haven't seen the results yet published to know whether or not, whether these results have been evaluated. Informed curtailment is typically applied to target species, such as condors or golden eagles, in conjunction either with radar or VHF tracking. For example, condors that have transmitters on them can be tracked, and if they're approaching a wind facility, there can be a decision made when whether to shut down a turbine or a string of turbines. Many eagle conservation plans talk about using biomonitors or human observers to look for eagles and then shut down turbines to reduce collision risk. And now there are camera-based systems that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment to support informed curtailment, automated systems that are being developed. And so, just immediately following up on that, I'm now on technologies to minimize impacts. I'm sorry, I haven't been.
It's all right, we've been keeping up.
Thank you. Just go back and see whether, I'm back. We'll see if this works. So there's a lot of interest in developing technologies to minimize collision impacts, with a particular focus on golden eagles and other raptors. Various automated detection systems such as cameras and radar, and either independently or in conjunction with deterrent systems such as visual or UV light or acoustic-based deterrent systems, with the idea of alerting and or dissuading eagles and other raptors away from turbines. And the question is whether or not they work, and how do we evaluate them in such a way so as to provide a robust evaluation of the technology. One example, we funded work by Granger Hunt and Chris McClure at the Peregrine Fund to evaluate UV light as an effective deterrent for raptors. And in the words of Granger Hunt, we found no palpable response. The raptors, including golden eagles, different species we tested, essentially seemed indifferent to the presence of ultraviolet light. This is that. Basically, that study was what I would say is the launch of AWWI's technology verification program, which is a program intended to first identify and catalog the available minimization technologies that are out there, and then develop coordinated third-party evaluation of these technologies. And the development of the study design are subject to peer review, and the studies ultimately are intended to be made public and, if warranted, published in peer-reviewed journals. So we have several projects underway right now. We have evaluation of a detection and deterrent technology at a California wind facility, which is wrapping up with a final report due at the end of the year. We've just completed an evaluation of Identiflight, which is pictured here down in the lower right-hand corner, which is a camera-based system intended to detect eagles and support informed curtailment. It's based on machine learning, where there's a video library that is rapidly compared when a detection event occurs. And you see the camera system here. There are these, the lower cameras. I'm going to see if I can get wide angle, provide a 360-degree projection or coverage, and when an eagle or target species is sighted, the binocular camera, if you will, turns to track and provide an identification. In this case, in the case of the study that we just completed, eagle or non-eagle. And we'll have more information on that. We're completing a final report and preparing a manuscript for publication. But the short version is that it works very well. We also were recently awarded 2 DOE grants to evaluate Identiflight further at additional wind facilities and over multiple years, and evaluate DT Bird, which is a detection and deterrent system. And those projects are just beginning. And the technology verification program focuses not just on raptors, but we're also going to be identifying potential additional bat deterrent technologies for evaluation. And Chris talked some about the projects that he's working on, and we hope to supplement that activity and work with BCI and BWEC as those move forward. In terms of compensation, we've been doing, AWWI has been doing work with our outside experts to develop alternate options for compensating for take of golden eagles at wind energy facilities, and the kinds of compensation, even though the focus is golden eagle and the models are geared toward golden eagles, they would have broader application, I think, for all raptors that engage in similar behavior that we're trying to mitigate. For example, ingesting lead at gut piles from during the hunting season. We have a lead model, voluntary lead abatement model that was published in Ecological Applications, and we have a vehicle strike model which involves removing roadkill and therefore reducing the risk of vehicle strikes for eagles and potentially other raptors and wildlife that feed on these carcasses. And we're developing a third model to evaluate the effects of habitat improvement on eagle productivity. And so we're close to basically having an expanded toolbox of multiple mitigation strategies, and are now working to implement these models. Where we have been for the past few years is developing these statistical models, and now we're gearing up towards assisting with the implementation and use of these models in either eagle conservation plans or mitigation banks. And one of our models, vehicle collision model, has actually been incorporated into an eagle conservation plan. So to wrap up in talking about further research needs, over the past 6-7 months, AWWI, in concert with its partners and with input from the industry, the state and federal wildlife agencies, DOE, USGS, input from all of those and review from all of those sources, we developed a National Wind Wildlife Research Plan, which is available on our website, and it covers a period of the next 3 years. And the research plan covers, in broad outline, major research topics that AWWI intends to focus on in the next 3 years. And just some examples of high-level priorities focus primarily on bald and golden eagles and migratory birds, but continuing efforts to develop best management practices for avoiding and minimizing take, implementing and finishing our work on offsetting eagle take, and then supporting efforts to enhance take prediction models. And then more broadly for birds, using our American Wind Wildlife Information Center to develop more accurate estimates of avian impacts, and supporting development of evaluation of measures to mitigate collision impacts. So that's my presentation, and with the other speakers, I'm looking forward to answering your questions, and I thank you for listening.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Tabor. And now, before we get to questions, we're going to have Davia tell us about an upcoming wind and wildlife workshop. So let's just, okay, we've got the slide up. So Davia, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks, Paige. And hi, everybody. And I'm going to be pretty quick here and hopefully give you lots of time to ask questions from the presenters. This is just a quick advertisement for the Wind and Wildlife Workshop that the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is putting on with the American Wind Wildlife Institute, Bat Conservation International, and the National Renewable Energy Lab. It's a workshop that we've done the last few years, and it'll be October 10th through October 14th at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Broomfield, Colorado. And a lot of what you heard about today will be on the agenda for this workshop in much more detail, and really going into details of how you do this kind of work for pre-construction surveys, post-construction fatality monitoring, fatality estimation, thermal and near-infrared videography, and impact reduction strategies and mitigation options. So the workshop is a great opportunity to get your hands on using some of these techniques and seeing the field equipment, since there is actual wind turbines at the Renewable Energy Lab where we'll be. So we are finalizing the agenda and registration information, which should be available at the beginning of August. But if you're interested in more information about the workshop, you can email Rebecca at Conservation International, and her email is there on the screen. And the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has money set aside to help support state fish and wildlife agency travel to the workshop. So you can go ahead and email me if you're interested in getting some of that support so you or your staff can attend the workshop. So thanks for your time today. I hope you learned quite a bit from the previous presenters, and if you want to learn more, please reach out to us about the workshop. Thanks.
Great, thank you. This is Lauren, and I'm going to be going through the questions for our speakers. As a reminder, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Send them our way. We've already got a few that have come in over the course of the presentation. So to start, I will go back to a few for you, Chris, on bats and wind energy. And the first one is kind of general, but I think we probably have some folks on the line who are relatively new to these issues and others who've been working on them for decades. But could you just really quickly define what cut-in speed is and what feathering is? Brief explanations for those who may not know what those terms mean.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I think there's probably some varying definitions, but the cut-in speed is the speed at which the turbines begin rotating and generating electricity. And for many turbines, the manufacturer's cut-in speed is somewhere between 3 or 4 meters per second. And so it's at that speed that power is generated. And when we talk about raising the cut-in speed, we're talking about moving that to maybe 5, 6, 6.5 meters per second, because we recognize that bats are more active at lower wind speeds. So if we can keep the turbines from spinning at these low wind speeds, it reduces bat fatalities. And feathering is just a way of either rotating the nacelle out of the wind or rotating the turbine blades so they don't catch the wind or parallel to the wind, to prevent the turbine from spinning at high RPMs.
Great, thank you. A question came in about the notes you made about the fall distribution of bats, and asking if there are any published studies on that.
There aren't any published studies at this point, but I believe there will be here soon. A couple of different organizations have noticed this, and we've been talking about this, but nothing available to read at this point, but hopefully by later this year there will be.
Great, thanks. So this question, I'm not sure if I understand, but I'm going to read it off, and hopefully it will make sense to you. And this may be, other folks may want to chime in here. But it's asking why not model bird and bat mortality like we model other count processes? With daily searches, could we not nullify the scavenger factor? In Maine, it is corvids that learn where to find food, and scavenging can be 75% on day number 1, given weekly or 3-day searches.
Well, certainly your search interval should reflect what the persistence rate or scavenging removal is. So if you've got a really short persistence or high removal rate, then you need to have more frequent searches. to account for that, and daily searches may be required. But in many instances where your persistence can be days or weeks, in order to get a fatality estimate, frequent searches aren't necessary. If you're trying to get other information during the study, like trying to relate a fatality to the previous night's condition, then more frequent searches may be warranted regardless of the persistence, just so that you can find more fresh carcasses, those that you can feel confident that they died the previous night and you know the weather condition to relate that to. So certainly persistence should be accounted for in your search interval.
Great, thank you. And one more question related to bats. What does the evidence show regarding bats not echolocating around wind turbines? How does this affect use of acoustic monitoring at wind turbines?
So there's not a lot of publicly available information of detectors being on turbines and monitoring bat activity in that manner. But a study from Hawaii that was led by the USGS showed that Hawaiian hoary bats may not be echolocating as they're in and around the wind turbines. It's a different subspecies than the mainland hoary bat, different ecology, but it points to it may not be effective for some species, or let me say this differently, that some species may not be echolocating, others might be. The other kind of issue with this is these cone of receptions of these detectors is relatively small with respect to the airspace around the turbine. And so where bats, if you've got your detectors below the nacelle, you're obviously not going to detect bats above the nacelle and vice versa. So some of it may be a sampling issue, some of it may be a species issue. And so I think it just warrants more investigation.
Great, thanks. One more has come in. Are there any studies that have looked at bat fatalities at wind farms alongside cattle grazing operations versus those that are not near cattle grazing operations?
I don't know of any studies that have discussed that. There likely to have been studies that have those different conditions, but there's not any publicly available information on how that might affect search efficiency or persistence. So if there's some data out there that someone has that shows that there might be a distinct difference between those two types of search conditions, that would be important to know.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Chad, I think we can turn to you for some grouse questions. And the first one is asking how you're comparing the results of the gradient study design versus the Bakke study design between the two Greater Prairie chicken studies, with the one in Nebraska and the other in Kansas, respectively.
Sure. So I think it's more of survival relative to turbine locations, and whether you're in the Bakke design or a gradient design, there's still this relationship between distance to turbine and survival. So I think that's where we're focusing in on is what is the relationship between turbines and survival in these survival models.
Okay, great, thank you. Is there any evidence that grouse are using the new roads as lek sites?
Based on my experience, no, I haven't seen any of the roads that are associated with the wind facilities become active lek sites. I have seen greater sage grouse, sit in the shade of of the turbine. That's the only actual interaction I've seen, grouse and actual infrastructure.
Great, thanks. And then the second part to that question is if there's been any studies looking at predator surveys and if there's been any higher predation due to the increased corridors for mammals.
Yes, that Smith et al. Paper in 2017 in Ecosphere, they focus on predation, and if I recall correctly, they did not detect a significant difference of predator density in the facility. But please refer back to that publication to confirm.
Great, thanks. All right, and then a few questions for you, Tabor, and then we have one kind of general one. The first one is asking about what is being done about the bias from using ducks for scavenger removal trails as a surrogate for raptors. Do we have a sense of how much this biases the data?
We do have a sense, I think, and hopefully, it will be available in the published literature very soon. But the work that I described, the raptor work, fatality estimates that Wes did under funding from AWWI also included the development of what I would call raptor-specific searcher efficiency and carcass persistence correction factors by the size, including the size of the raptors. So kestrel has a different detectability and persistence than say a red-tailed hawk. But there has been some work done on that and should be available soon.
Great, thanks. You may not be able to say much on this, but can you speak to kind of anything related to the cost of some of these detection deterrent systems that are being evaluated right now?
Well, I guess what I can say is that our two DOE-funded studies were approximately in the range of $1.6 million each. And that includes, is divided into funding from DOE and the cost share provided by AWWI. And those, that funding covers the equipment, which, can be pretty expensive, as well as all the labor associated with the field work. But, the individual costs, I think many of these technologies are still under development and not at commercial scale. And some of the ones that I am familiar with, that information is proprietary, and I can't speak to a specific cost of a technology or a unit of a technology, because that's often negotiated between the vendor and the company.
Mm-hmm. One quick question asking, is prairie grouse not a priority for AWWI? Going back to the tables you were showing from the National Wind Wildlife Research Plan.
Yes, prairie grouse are or is, is that a plural noun or not? I don't know. But those species are a priority of AWWI. I only showed those topics that were specifically focused on the subject matter of my talk. But if you go look at the research plan, you can see what our priorities are. We have species-focused priorities on the eagles, migratory birds, prairie grouse, and bats. And then we have what we call cross-cutting priorities that apply to all of those groups. So I encourage you to go to our website and get all the details.
Great, thanks. So we have run out of time. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but we can follow up afterwards. And a few closing remarks from Paige.
Okay, great. Lauren, would you mind bringing up the last slide, please? I just wanted to let everybody know about a resource that AWWI has recently updated. We have a wind turbine interaction with wildlife and their habitats, a summary of research results and priority questions, which is a summary of wind wildlife research updates that we update every year. So we have just put out our 2017 update, and the link is up there on the slide, and you can find it on the AWWI website. And then just to remind everyone that the recording and presentation slides from this webinar will be posted on the NWCC site shortly, so you'll be able to access it there. And of course, we want to thank all of our presenters today so much. We really appreciate you sharing these latest updates with us. Very interesting. I know everyone appreciates hearing what's going on in wind wildlife research. And then as a last remark, I just wanted to let everybody in attendance know that NWCC will be hosting webinars like this every few months, and we're always looking for topics of interest to the wind wildlife community. So if anyone has any ideas or topics they would like to present, please let us know. You can email me at pjohnson@awwi.org, and thank you so much for attending. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.